Hey, if you're a journalist who uses the tool Help a Reporter Out, or Harrow, listen up. Harrow is moving to Cision's new app, Connectively. But what is Connectively? Well, imagine a place where you can quickly connect with expert sources for your next story. Connectively is a new app from Cision that's changing the way journalists, like us, content creators, experts and PRs work together. So if you're in search of credible sources, Connectively is your next stop. With just a click, you can publish your queries. These go straight to a feed where experts from loads of different backgrounds can respond, giving you their expertise. So go on, visit connectively.us to sign up for free. That's connectively.us. Connectively.us.
Hello and welcome back to Series 14 of Freelancing for Journalists.
In this series, we are celebrating and learning more about our Freelance Journalism Award winners.
Yes, we're chatting with our winners to find out more about their fantastic work, and this week is one of our double hitters.
Yes, but as always, before we get to this week's guest, we're going to have a quick chat about our win of the week. So what's yours this week, Emma?
Okay, well, yeah, mine, I was just a bit lucky this week because I'd been working on 3 pieces that had been taking ages for various reasons. So I was a bit worried about cash flow because I only just finished one of them. Two of the others were kind of grinding on a bit. And then this week, out of the blue, I got 3 really quick, fast turnaround, well-paid commissions about stories that I already knew about, I had contacts on, didn't take me very long at all, and I wasn't expecting them. And they're all from people who pay really quickly. So I just know now that I've done that and I banked it. And that's money in the bank. And it just happened at a point at which I was thinking, oh, my cash flow is going to go a bit awry here. So it was almost like they knew it was a sign. But none of it took very long. So it was doable. So it was, that was a win. I need to remember that sometimes those wins do happen. So Lily, what's your win of the week?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because it's tricky after the summer. I think you know, if you're doing less work, even if you're like suddenly busy, you've got this like cash flow problem. So yeah, it's good that you have them come in. Mine's actually a repetition of one I did an episode or 2 back, because I've got a story that I've been pitched in January, got picked up in, I think it was in March. I wrote it and filed it in April, and I mentioned, yay, it's going in this week a couple of weeks ago. It didn't go in. It has gone in today, finally. So this is like a 9-month process with this one story. And there has been loads of legal over the last week. And I think the case study has kind of been having quite a wobble over the last few weeks. There's been a lot of back and forth. And so I'm just really relieved that it's now published. It's done. I got paid half up front and I'm going to get the second half now it's been published. So that was quite good that I didn't have to wait 9 months for the payment either. So that has been published. So
it's got half up front because I really remember when you first pitched this. That was so long ago.
I know. And I was sat on it. But it's in now. It's done. I can move on.
Hooray, hooray. Well, well done. Well done for getting that over the line.
Right, it's time to introduce our guest. Today we have Liz Cookman, who won our Best Print Journalism Award and our Best Specialist Journalist category. Liz is a foreign correspondent currently based in Ukraine. She produces on-the-ground reports, in-depth features and news stories from dangerous and challenging environments for some of the world's most respected outlets, including The Guardian, Economist, Sunday Times, Telegraph and Channel 4 News. Our judges noted that she had produced an amazing body of work from Ukraine that had been highly impactful.
Congratulations on the win, Liz. Double win. We're so pleased to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
We have lots and lots of questions for you about the pieces you submitted, which, like our judges said, were really powerful. But first, let's get going by if you could tell us a bit about yourself and your career so far. How does one become a freelance foreign correspondent?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think one that's a bit tricky to answer because I think lots of people have different routes, and I definitely have a very non-typical experience and route into it. So for me personally, I didn't actually start my career until quite late. I went to uni at 25, which means I didn't graduate until my late 20s, and I didn't become a journalist until my 30s. And I studied creative writing, so I knew that I wanted to write and I knew I wanted to travel. It just took me quite a while to figure out how those things went together and in what format I put those things together. So I moved abroad. I moved to Turkey because I wanted to experience the world. And at that time, there was a lot of news in Turkey. There were a lot of bombings. There was an attempted coup. There was all sorts going on. So that's when I really realized that that's what I wanted to do. So I managed to get a job at a Middle East newspaper in Abu Dhabi, and I worked there for a few years. And that's where I kind of learned about the industry. I learned how things work. I learned a lot about the region. And then when I felt ready to go alone, I went freelance. That was in towards the end of 2020. So it was in the middle of the pandemic. So it was quite a difficult time to go freelance. And straight off, I went to Nagorno-Karabakh, where there was a war. I caught COVID there. I spent quite a while in isolation, which was very inconvenient. And then I moved to Turkey. I actually got expelled from Turkey because of my reporting, and that's how I ended up in Ukraine. So yeah, I've been living in Ukraine for the last almost 3 years now. And yeah, that's how I became a full-time foreign correspondent. But for a lot of people, it's a very different route. The more traditional route is that people study languages or history or international relations. They get maybe a master's in journalism from City University, then they get an editorial graduate scheme at a newspaper, and then they go freelance, which I think is probably a much easier path.
Yeah, but I guess we're finding from talking to guests on the podcast over the last few years, there are so many different routes. And yes, there are these traditional routes, but there's a lot of people out there that don't go those kind of paths. So I think it just shows you, doesn't it? If you've got, tenacity and really want to do it, then you can kind of come into journalism from all sorts of different angles. I mean, just kind of going back to our awards, obviously you won 2 of our awards. They were both actually sponsored by the NUJ freelance branch, and you entered several pieces of work. But it's probably easiest, I guess, to talk about your work as a whole. But let's start, now you're working in Ukraine. Can you give us a sense of what it's been like to report from Ukraine?
So it's kind of evolved over time, I would say. In the run up to the war, it was really strange actually, because there was this big disconnect between what the international media wanted to see and what was the reality. Everybody wanted these stories of Ukrainians panicking as the US warns of this imminent invasion, but that just wasn't what was happening. Ukrainians were very calm, actually. So that was kind of a bit of a challenge, and I spent a lot of time covering the sort of tensions on the previous front line with the Russia-aligned separatists in the east. And then since the war has started, it's very full on. It's especially, I think the way that foreign journalism perhaps differs from some other types of journalism is that it's a fully immersive experience, right? You're sort of living right in the crisis, and people are having bombs dropped on them, you're having bombs dropped on you, and it's a very intense thing. Most of the people covering the war are covering it on rotation, so they come in for maybe 2-3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and then they leave. I'm one of the only people who stayed pretty much the whole time, because I'm freelance, which allows me to do it. And it's been, for me as a journalist, an incredible experience. One that I probably wouldn't have been able to have if I wasn't a freelancer, right? Because when you work at a newspaper, there's so much competition over who wants to do what, and it can be political. There's lots of reasons that you might not get sent to Ukraine, whereas as a freelancer, I was able to do that. But it's also extremely difficult to work as a freelancer. I don't have, most of the time, I don't have operational support or logistical support, editorial support. I don't have security. If something happened to me, there's nobody to pick up the pieces. So, it is very, very challenging.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned about being expelled from Turkey because of the reporting you were doing. So challenging, but also like you want to keep telling these stories, right? As a reporter, you want to make sure these stories are heard. So you're battling with perhaps there's people who don't want the stories to be heard, but also at the same time with editors in the UK who perhaps have a certain amount of fatigue as time passes, as the war goes on. Kind of, how hard is it for you to kind of fight for those stories to be told on those two fronts, I suppose?
Yeah, I think Ukraine in many ways is a slightly unique story, and certainly I think it's quite different, for example, to the Middle East, where, for example, Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, everything that's happening at the moment. This is sort of a situation that's happened again and again and has been happening for decades. Whereas Ukraine, the full-scale invasion was quite a fresh story, although there was a conflict in the East since 2014. And it was such a huge story because I don't think anybody really expected that they would see a war in Europe in their lifetime. So there was so much shock, which led to so much engagement, that it's been such a huge story. And so many outlets have told me that even now Ukraine is their biggest hitting story. They're always interested. But yeah, it can be difficult. I mean, this year has been the most difficult year in terms of getting commissions. Mainly that's because desks just don't have a budget anymore because there is this other conflict in the Middle East, because there's also a US election this year. And most newspapers are still struggling with their own, how they fund their journalism. So yeah, it's been very challenging this year. But that's for everybody. Every freelancer I know has had a very difficult year this year. But yeah, I found that the thing is that I tend to try to find stories that nobody else is doing. And I tend to try and fill the gap between what staff reporters are doing and what news desks are doing, and find something in the middle somewhere, the kind of the piece of the puzzle that people are forgetting. And I think that helps a lot, because if I try to do news, then I'm competing with the staff, then that's a whole different thing. That's a lot more difficult. But I think as the war goes on, it's certainly going to become more and more challenging to find new stories and new angles.
Yeah. I just want to pick up on two things there, because firstly, I think that's fascinating, this idea that there's more competition. Like if there's other conflicts in the world, or like you say, things like the US election, that then is competing against what is going on in Ukraine, no matter how kind of newsworthy that is. I guess we don't always kind of see it like that, sort of from the outside. But yeah, also that idea of kind of picking up on those stories that no one else is getting. And I think one of the stories you entered to our awards, which the judges were really impressed by, was about the man who'd been captured and tortured in Ukraine and was living by himself in the forest. Can you tell us a bit more about how that story came about and how you found it?
Yes, so I was doing some research about sexual violence, because it's being used systematically as a weapon of war, which happens in a lot of conflicts, but it's definitely happening in Ukraine. And I was particularly interested in sexual violence that's happening to men, because it makes up about a third of the cases in Ukraine, but you never really see anybody talk about it, or you don't see many many case studies on it. And so I was trying to find men that would be willing to speak, and I was speaking to NGOs who had worked with men to kind of learn more about it. And one of these NGOs told me about Oleg. They'd worked with him since he had left Eastern Ukraine a few years before, and they knew him very well. And they told me about his situation, and they said that, you know, he's quite a talkative guy, so he might be willing to talk. And as soon as he told me that this guy told me a bit about his story, that he had suffered all these terrible, you know, he'd been treated absolutely terribly. He'd been taken captive twice by Russian forces. He'd been subject to torture, years of wrongful imprisonment and sexual violence, and that he was now living in a bunker that he'd made for himself in the woods. I couldn't believe his story. It seemed so, awful, but also incredibly interesting. So I just absolutely knew I had to meet him. And I was very lucky with The Economist 1843, because I have a good relationship with them, but a lot of outlets I don't think would take that story, because it wasn't news, it wasn't, you know, part of any of the big stories going on at that time. And he also there's often people don't want stories unless it was 100% something that happened just now in this conflict. And a lot of his problems had come from the previous conflict in the East. So I was very lucky that they saw something in the story, so they were happy to go with it. But yeah, I was very proud of that story. And one thing I was really proud of with that story is that it made such a big difference, because it basically sparked a lot of media coverage within Ukraine after that story. And he ended up getting a year's worth of financial assistance by decree from President Zelensky. And he's now getting, he also told me that basically people thought he was a bit weird before. When he went to shelters and tried to get help, people wouldn't let him in. But now, because people have seen that story, their whole thinking, their attitude towards him has changed. So now he's getting a lot more help. So that was really nice. And yeah, sorry, I didn't say as well, but for anybody that hasn't read the story, the guy basically, his name is Oleg. He's formerly a philosophy lecturer that lived in Eastern Ukraine, and his home was occupied in 2014. He was taken hostage by the occupying forces and then let go. And a few years later, he was blogging anonymously about life in occupied territory, and he was arrested again, spent 2.5 years in a DPR, Donetsk People's Republic prison, before then being released and deciding to build a forest bunker in a nature reserve near Kiev, and basically living off-grid in a sort of a palace he'd made for himself from scavenged materials from a nearby rubbish dump. It was, he has a very unique story.
Yeah, that's such a unique story. And I think, one of the things that strikes me, and you were talking about kind of having contacts with NGOs there and kind of how you come across these stories. But when you're freelance, you're doing everything yourself, right? You're your own fixer, everything. And I think probably the biggest question that, our listeners will have around that is, how do you ensure your personal safety when reporting from a war zone, when reporting on difficult stories? Have you done specific training? How do you kind of take steps to protect yourself?
Yeah, so I've done something called hostile environments training, which I did in 2019, and then I did a refresher. And basically, I went to a Jordanian special forces camp, and they train you on what to do in terms of emergency medicine, and then also what to do in various situations, like if you're getting shot at or shelled, or, and at some point in the training, they kidnap you also, which is meant to make you understand what a situation would be like if that happened to you, so you know how to stay calm. So yeah, I've done all of that previously, but it's very different from actually operating in a conflict zone, which can be very difficult. Even just living in Kiev, there are regular drone and missile strikes, regular blackouts, which cause their own challenges, because things like the crossings on roads go out, so roads can become very dangerous, and You know, I've done a lot of frontline reporting, which, you know, I've had near misses with Grad rockets. I've had near misses with Russian tanks. It can be very dangerous. I try now to limit that because I am freelance and it's silly to put myself in that much danger for a story. And to be perfectly honest, like often the frontline stories or the frontline areas, you don't get the best stories because it's so difficult to operate and to speak to people that you get little bits of quotes and bits of stories. You don't get like a full deep dive into what's happening. So most of the time it's not worth it. But the most important thing I think is to protect your mental health, because if you're not feeling good and if you're not in a good place, then you're going to make bad decisions. And so that needs to be like a really, really strong priority, which can be very difficult when you're living somewhere where maybe the food isn't good, maybe you don't have access to the exercise you normally would. You know, you're living in very kind of cramped, difficult conditions some of the time. But yeah, I mean, you just have to be super aware of all of those things, I think.
Yeah, and you're speaking to people who've been through horrific experiences as well, in terms of kind of how much you take that on board.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I personally know people who've ended up with PTSD just through the interviews that they've conducted, because it can be, you're listening to extremely harrowing experiences and you're surrounded by people. Generally, when people speak to you, it's the worst day of their life, right? Like it's something awful has happened to them. Like a few months ago, for example, I was in the Kiev Children's Hospital just after a missile had hit it. And I was speaking to a family whose son, he was heavily disabled, he had a neurological condition, and he was recovering from surgery, and the hospital had been hit by a missile. You know, and like, you can't imagine anything so awful happening to you. Like, it's so awful. And so, yes, it can be very difficult. There was one time where I actually had to take a break out of Ukraine because somebody I interviewed, it affected me so much. Like, so she was a young girl, I think she was 6, and it was in April 2022, and her parents and sister had just been killed in the attack on the Mariupol Drama Theatre. And her grandparents, her whole family, they were sheltering in the drama theatre when it was attacked. Her parents and her sister were killed, and her grandparents had managed to escape. And she was so vacant, you know, there was no, you know, children are kind of animated, they laugh, they play, they speak, they move around. There was nothing, like, she was just so blank. And I found it so affecting that, yeah, I had to leave Ukraine for a few weeks because it was a lot to take in.
Yeah. I can't imagine what it's like to just be constantly coming up against that. Yeah, like you say, looking after your mental health is so important. I mean, you've talked there about some of the challenges, but I wonder if there's anything else, you know, maybe like logistics that have been a particular challenge since you've been out there reporting.
Yeah, logistics are always really difficult. I mean, for example, with reporting in Ukraine, you have to have, you know, special accreditation, and you often have to get special permission for each story or each region that you want to go to. That can be difficult. They're extremely prejudiced against freelancers, which can make it really, really hard. In fact, at times I've been told I couldn't have access to things because I was a freelancer. And I managed to get in the end, but it took a lot of extra mental stress that wasn't necessary. But yeah, the logistics, if you're a freelancer and you don't have that support, you know, with resources and backup to get to a place, to have a driver, to stay in a decent hotel, to know that if something goes wrong and the car breaks down or somebody gets injured, that there's money to help you out, it can be extremely, extremely difficult. And it's mentally very difficult. And I'd say actually one of the hardest parts about reporting on a war, or specifically Ukraine, is the being freelance. I found that it was the industry that I felt the most mentally traumatized by, more than the war, because the war I could understand. The war is awful, But the industry is like, there are rules, and then the rules are broken, and then there are different rules, and you're constantly trying to navigate all this stuff. Meanwhile, you're often surrounded by people who are in staff jobs and have a very different situation from you, right? So it's like a constant kick in the teeth. So yeah, it can be extremely, extremely difficult. And I just, and often I stayed in Ukraine too long. So I'd maybe live at 6-7 months without taking a break out of the country again, because I'm freelance, so I have to pay my own costs. And that would cause problems. And certainly with logistics, even getting in and out of Ukraine is very difficult. I mean, I don't know how much you know about it, but there's no flights into Ukraine, right? So I recently left Ukraine to go to my cousin's wedding, and it took me 4 days to get there to the north of England. So yeah, the logistics are a constant challenge. So even what would be in another scenario quite a straightforward story turns into something quite complicated.
Yeah, and I think when kind of someone is reading that final piece that's been produced, they will have no idea of all that, because when people think of journalists kind of overseas, they think of those staffers who have the whole editorial team behind them and the support of big media organisations. So it's just so interesting to hear.
And there's also like language barriers and stuff like that. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, that, like, you know, often needing translation. In Ukraine there are 2 languages. So like yeah, it can be very difficult.
Yeah. And actually, I do wonder how those languages. So one of the things that that kind of struck me about your piece, I think, is you always find the humanity of the situation. Like it's always like, yeah, those are the kind of stories that to me bring it home much more, about a war zone than kind of the political machinations of decisions that are being made. And it must be harder when you have that translation, because I once did an interview by Zoom, but with a doctor who was working in, who was from Ukraine. He didn't speak English, but his wife did. So we were doing the translation through his wife. And that must be, I don't know if that's harder to kind of get to those stories, to understand what someone's position and what that means and get the emotion out of it. How have you found that?
Well, definitely with translation, interviews take a lot longer, right? An interview that maybe normally would take 20 minutes ends up taking an hour. So that's difficult, because you also are like aware that you're taking up somebody's time. Sometimes when they're very upset or having, a really bad day, you don't want to make somebody sit there for 2 hours and being grilled, right? But yeah, I mean, I tend to try and focus on the sort of the human cost of the war, because I really think it's the most important thing. I mean, that's what war is really. It's the cost to the population more than anything else. And I think it's easy for people to become really disconnected from words on a page and news updates, especially when we're in this intense news cycle all the time. And news has sort of become a form of entertainment. So I think it's like really important to show that this is the reality. Like, these are the people who are living that news item. And so yeah, that's what really drives me. But it's a challenge, and it's a challenge to find people who want to speak also, because people don't always want to have to relive their trauma, and I don't always want to make people relive their trauma, right? Especially when it comes to sexual violence survivors and things like that. I don't really want them to have to go over what happened to them, so I tend to try and focus on them and how things have affected them, rather than the details of exactly what happened.
Yeah. And I guess you're gathering, so much material. And I wonder what your process is. Say, your word count is 1,000 words, but you've got, these really kind of in-depth interviews with people who have got such kind of, maybe complex, harrowing backstories. Like, how do you go about getting that into the word count? Do you have a particular process?
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I guess I've over-reported many times, because sometimes you want to make sure that you get it right, and then it becomes such a nuanced picture in your head that it's very difficult to write it in this simple structure, especially the form that particularly British news prefers, which is very like bold claims and very little nuance. So I always say to people when I talk to other journalists about it, and when people ask my advice, is that I think you have to think about what stands out most in your own memory, and like what you would talk about and what you would bring up if you were telling your friends about it, because I think that's a strong sign that it's the most visceral part of the story. And so that's a really good place to start and like work out from, whether that becomes the intro or just the kind of core idea of the story. I think it's the best place to begin.
Yeah, it's taking that step back, isn't it? Because you must become so invested in these stories when you've kind of, done so many interviews, perhaps gone back and visited people kind of time and time again, etc. It's like taking that step back and going, how do you really condense this down into the key elements, which I think is, really tricky. You started giving a bit of advice there, so this is a really good segue into, for anyone who's listened to this and still has the yes, I want to go and do some foreign reporting. What's your advice for anyone who's kind of looking to travel overseas to a difficult environment, war zone, to do journalism?
So I think first of all, you have to go into it with your eyes open. Like, this is not the journalism of the 1980s or 90s. It's not like perhaps books you've read where there are like hundreds of foreign correspondents having a great time in like Bosnia, reporting on a war in the day and partying all night. Like, it's just not the same industry anymore. So you have to go into it with your eyes wide open. It's very hard. A lot of people have to have a side hustle. In some ways, journalism has almost become, depending on what you cover, it has to be a hobby now, because it can be so hard to get commissions, and commissions are often not very well paid. And so you have to completely live for it. Like, it has to be something that you are absolutely willing to do despite the bad pay and bad conditions, right? So I think it's really important to have that expectation that you're doing it because you want to, not for any other reason. I think also, like, secondly, I'd say to people, languages, because it's become so important now, because desks don't have money anymore that to support people with extra help, such as translators, that languages have become more and more important. So I think that's really key. The advice always used to be, oh, just get out there and do it. But I don't think that 100% rings true anymore, because I think there used to be a lot of local outlets. For example, in Beirut, a lot of people used to move to Beirut and work for the Daily Star, which doesn't exist anymore. Or they do stories for smaller online outlets that kind of don't really exist anymore. So that's become very difficult. And even if a story is great, it can be hard to get it commissioned. I had a story that I could not get anybody to take for a while, and I eventually got it commissioned by the Sunday Times, and it won an award, but nobody would take it for ages. So, it can be very difficult. Anyway, so yeah, I don't want it to all sound negative. It's also an amazing job, right? You get to witness history in the making, not to sound like a cliche, and like you get to meet incredible people and do incredible things. So yeah, you have to look at it that way. Unfortunately, it's an industry, the whole industry tends to be skewed towards people from a more privileged background, and certainly from, private school educated background. And I'd say that's even more pronounced in foreign reporting. It can be very difficult if you don't have any money behind you or anything like that. And like, certainly I'm not from that background, so I'm a bit of an anomaly. So I think people, have to go into it understanding all of that and still wanting to do it.
Yeah, you've got to have that real passion for it, haven't you? To kind of be able to juggle all of that. Well, it's been really fascinating talking to you, and we have kind of one last sort of roundup question that we're asking all of our award winners, and that is, do you have something kind of on your bucket list as a freelance journalist that you would like to do? Is there, a particular story that you'd like to cover, or someone, you'd really like to interview, or publication you'd like to work for? Kind of what is at the top of your list?
Well, I think most foreign reporters would say like the New York Times, right? That's usually considered the kind of pinnacle of foreign reporting for a lot of people. But I'd have to say that actually probably my biggest ambition would be do something that I'm already doing, which is writing narrative long reads for The Economist 1843, because I absolutely love writing for them and I love doing that sort of thing. So I guess my dream would be to do that more. And or perhaps my dream would be that somebody launches a new English language publication that there's a magazine called Der Spiegel in Germany, and when they do foreign reporting, they do it in a very different way to English language reporting, which can be like, hey, you've got 2 hours, this is the story we want to see, go and get it. And they will usually tend to spend maybe like a week and a half on a story, and then put everything they have into like a really strong, nuanced dispatch. And I really love that. I really respect that kind of reporting. So my dream would be for there to be an English language publication that has the budget to do that.
I really like that answer. Nobody yet has said, I want this new publication in place so I can do that type of reporting that I wanted. As a perfect answer. And now you put it out into the world. Let's make
I really hope so.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Well, we could definitely talk to you about this all day long, Liz. It's so fascinating. But we have to bring this episode to a close. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. Congratulations again on your very well-deserved double win.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating. And I feel like we've only really touched the tip of the iceberg with this discussion. So, yeah, maybe we'll have you back in a future episode so we can delve into it a bit more. But for now, our listeners can find all of our resources at freelancingforjournalists.com. And if you're not a member already, come and find our Facebook group.
Yes, and just a final note to say thanks to our producer, Maddie Drury, and a huge thank you to all our Freelance Journalism Awards sponsors, which were not only a New Day freelance branch, but also Paydesk, Women in Journalism, Savanta X-Tiles, Birmingham City University, and News Associates. So yeah, we really appreciate their support in helping to put the awards on. And yeah, we'll be back with another award winner next week. Bye for now.
Goodbye.